So when we were watching the Get Back film, it was noticeable that I was actually quite shocked when it first came on, because I was thinking, have I got the right film here? Because obviously it starts with what looks like a fairly kind of traditional documentary about the history of the Beatles up until 1969. Yeah. And I believe as a Beatles historian, there are one or two things in there that you might take issue with.
Well, it was strange because they show you this black and white picture of Liverpool, then 1956 across there. In the background, you've got In Spite of All the Danger, the Quarrymen recorded in 1958. 1956, then they show you a photo of John and the Quarrymen from 1957, saying that John forms the Quarrymen. Then he says, Paul McCartney, age 14, joins. And then George Harrison, age 13, joins the Quarrymen. Well, those ages are wrong. They're right if you're placing them starting in 56, but they didn't. So Paul and John meet in July 57.
That's at St. Peter's Hall in Woolton.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Paul was 15.
Okay.
Then George joins at the end of 1957. Well, he's already 14, and he's not far off being 15. So it's simple stuff. I'm thinking, why are you doing that?
I suppose it's kind of the sort of stuff that in the bigger picture of this film kind of doesn't matter, but you'd think they'd get it right.
Well, it's simple stuff. But then they move on and say, the Beatles perform at the Cavern. So you've got the only footage that we have, which is August 62. John, Paul, George and Ringo performing. Then they say Brian Epstein discovers the Beatles at the Cavern. Well, that happened nearly 12 months before, in November 61, when Pete Best was the drummer. Ringo hadn't even joined. So that's in the wrong order. Doesn't make sense. Now, the basic things, but and this is where I'd be interested in your opinion. For me, if you're doing the setup, and you need the context before you get into why they're doing all the Get Back sessions, surely that should look like it's one piece. But for me, that beginning bit looked like it was an afterthought, and it's just been thrown on, and it just seemed disjointed with the rest of it.
I suppose you're right, and I suppose stylistically, the bulk of the film is this beautiful 16mm shot, multi-camera in Twickenham or in the Apple Studios that is of one piece. And then at the beginning of the film, you've got this thing which looks like a fairly traditional piece of documentary footage. And I must admit, when I first began to watch episode 1, a couple of minutes in, I was thinking, have I got the right film here? I didn't think this is what it was.
Yeah.
And you're right, I think that there is a little feeling of an afterthought about it. And someone said, do you think we should have a setup for this in some way and kind of try and suggest what a momentous year 69 was for the Beatles and what they had gone through before this point to turn them into who they were then? But it does feel like a bit of an afterthought, you know?
Because, you need some of that information in, particularly the key stuff is the fact that they stop performing live at the end of August 66. So then they are, and they make reference to this, don't they, that they become a recording band who make albums. They hadn't performed in front of an audience since then, until just before this all happens, when they're in Twickenham Studios shooting the promo video for Hey Jude, and they've got people who come up on the stage, and we've seen that sing-along. And I think they got a taste of, actually, this is why we sort of got into music. So that's how it starts, the whole process.
And also it's quite obvious throughout the whole film that they love playing together. You know, there's a beautiful sequence where essentially it's almost like a rock and roll medley they've got into. And I've got a few notes here. So they go into, I think it's Kansas City, which is an old Lieber and Stoller song. They then do Miss Anne, which I think was performed and maybe written by Little Richard. And then they follow that up with a Carl Perkins Blue Suede Shoes. And it's a fantastic medley. Yeah. And what I was thinking about when I watched that sequence was essentially what we're seeing is something that's been lifted from the set list from Hamburg probably nearly 10 years earlier. And you got a sense of, there was almost there'll have been a memory in the fingers. They can just pick the guitars up and play that stuff because they played it for so many hours, for so many nights in Hamburg. And that was a group of people really enjoying being with each other and really enjoying playing those songs.
And you could see that sometimes maybe there was a bit of tension, or they were struggling with whichever song they were working on, and they'd just go into goonish behaviour. So it'd be silly voices, but they'd revert back to those songs that were their bread and butter in those Liverpool and Hamburg days at the beginning. And you could see they still enjoyed playing them.
And we made that film looking for Lennon. And one of the reasons we made that was to try and capture Lennon's childhood in Liverpool during the 40s and the 50s. And there are so many references within this film back to that shared culture that they had in Britain in the 40s and 50s. One of the things that kind of sprang out at me was, I think Paul McCartney was trying to do Let It Be, and he'd done it 2 or 3 times, and suddenly Lennon says to him, just think about how Vera Lynn might have done it.
Yeah.
That reference to a woman who was a singer in the 40s and the 50s, who was almost like the entertainment face of the Second World War for Britain.
Yeah, and very, very traditional. And I think, again, it's references, just little things in conversation where they're talking about, they keep going back to their childhood, to their formative years. Paul has had much more of like the music hall upbringing with his dad's influences. But of course, the music they were listening to as kids, until they discovered Radio Luxembourg, was listening to what their parents were listening to. So you pick up those influences, and they get reflected all the way through their recording career in different songs and having fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is not in the film now, but one of the things that I just wanted to reference is that when you look at the set list that they played in Hamburg, it's not just rock and roll.
No.
And one that sprang out for me was that they sing Falling in Love Again, which was written in 1930, sung by Marlene Dietrich in The Blue Angel. So there's such a wide musical influence going on in the background of these 4 lads you see playing rock and roll.
Yeah, and the other thing that jumped out at me, and that's because I'd done this book, The Country of Liverpool, was that when they're saying, well, we need 14 songs to perform, we've only got a few, they start going back to some of those very first songs that John and Paul wrote. And these are ones where sometimes we've seen a reference to it in text, in a book somewhere, but we actually get to hear them. And straight off, they talk about one called Just Fun. Because I know you love me so, won't you please say goodbye? All 3 of them are country songs in a country style. And I think often people forget, and what I discovered in the research for the book was how big an influence country was on the Beatles when they were growing up. They do a copy of Midnight Special. And again, those influences, that was in the music they were listening to, the music that was coming into Liverpool. Hank Williams was huge, very, very popular. Liverpool being the Nashville of the North. While rock and roll and all that is happening here, Liverpool's got the biggest country and western scene in Britain, possibly in Europe.
And I think that's partly to do with the records coming in through the docks, but also, let's not forget the huge Irish population in Liverpool, and that country music always goes down well amongst Irish people. And there's a certain relationship between Irish music and country music. Did that come out in your researches?
Well, yeah, it did, because if you look at the roots of country music, the music that sort of came down from the Appalachian Mountains actually comes from Britain, particularly the Ulster Scots, from that northern part of Ireland and from Scotland. Those traditional songs went over to the Appalachian Mountains. That becomes roots country. And so actually, if you want to go for what are the roots of country music, well, actually it started over here, went over there,
bounces back again,
then bounces back. And it's like...
And then we send it back over there again.
Exactly, and that's what the Beatles did.
Yeah.
They were taking American music, putting a Liverpool spin on it, and selling it back to America.
It's musical tennis going back into it with the
Absolutely
Atlantic. The other old song that they played, which they used to do in the Hamburg set list, was Taste of Honey.
Yeah.
And there's that lovely moment, and again, it's this moment when Billy Preston turns up, and apparently Billy used to love that song. And I imagine he probably played it with them at some point in Hamburg. And so they do a little version of Taste of Honey for him, and the smile on his face is just a gorgeous thing to see.
Well, he was smiling the whole way through, and I think we mentioned it last time. Once he comes into the mix, and suddenly there's 5 of them, the mood gets lifted, and each of the 4 Beatles starts smiling, and it just makes such a difference with him in there, and just adding that extra instrument. Things think this has changed the dynamic, and it works so well.
Yeah. So we talked about stylistically how the film begins.
Yeah.
Right towards the end, obviously they get onto the roof.
Yeah.
They start doing their thing, and there's a little bit of split screen earlier in the film, but suddenly we're into a chunk of the film which is not exactly exclusively, but there's an awful lot of split screen stuff there.
Yeah.
And I was actually thinking, so I wonder why they've done that. What's been the reason to choose that? And I suppose part of it was Lindsay Hogg had maybe 7 cameras, maybe 8 cameras
least, yeah.
shooting. There was one on the roof over the road.
Yeah.
There were several around them. There was one going down to the street. They even had one in the foyer.
Yeah.
Which brilliantly, got these policemen coming and all that kind of stuff. And I suspect what Peter Jackson had looked at all this stuff and thought, there is such brilliant material here. Let's try and use it all. And one of the ways of doing that was to give you that multi-perspective of split screen. And it kind of adds to the excitement of what's going on the rooftop.
And the other thing that occurred to me when I was looking at that, particularly when he's got it split and you've got 4 pictures going, is the cover of Let It Be.
It's the cover.
Which is the 4 Beatles in their segments.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, I'm guessing it's a conscious decision, but I think, one of the main reasons has got to be there's so much amazing footage. How do we get it all in at the same time? And it works. It really works well. And even like with the closing credits, credits are rolling, but you've still got filming going on. And the story's still progressing. Do
you know, it's interesting that because when you make a film which is as big as that one, the credits can go on for 2 or 3 minutes, maybe even more. Yeah. And I've experienced this making films. And so you're trying to think, well, how can I keep people watching the screen while these credits are going through? Give them a bit more film. Yeah. And that works beautifully. And when you mention the split screen and it goes back to the album cover, there's also obviously the book that you've had a look at. Have you got anything you want to tell us about that book?
Well, the beauty of it is, it's as you would expect, it's a beautifully produced book. And I know I've already done like a quick review of that for the channel, but there's so many great photographs in there, and he's done it nicely chronological, because that's one of those key things.
So that mirrors the film, does it?
Yeah, it does it exactly. I think we mentioned this last time. A bit of the drama. Every now the calendar comes up and we're on day 13 or whatever it is, and there's so much to go. And it's got some nice bits of the dialogue again, which is lifted. It's beautifully made. It really is.
It smells like a new book as well.
You just love a new book smell. But the photos are fantastic, and so much of this we've never seen before. And we'll put a link in the description down below if people want to get hold of the book. But it's lovely. It really is.
Looks fabulous.
Especially got Mal with his hammer and his anvil for Maxwell's silver hammer.
And
timing it.
The interesting thing about that book, obviously, if you watch the film, you see the photographers in there. So you see the people who've been taking these photographs. Linda was in there taking some. Do we know any of the other photographers who were in there?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think there was so many that we used.
Yeah.
And one of the good things was I got this and I read it before I watched the series. And then I've gone back to it, and it makes much more sense now. That now I've seen all the episodes, I then go back to this. And it just adds to it. So,
do you know, there's a couple of things I would say about that. I've got a friend who has got this theory that there's never ever been a bad photograph taken of the Beatles, and it's partly to do with the dynamic of the 4 of them and the fact they weren't bad looking lads, and they dressed quite well and they were always ahead of the fashion. And so he says anyone who pointed a camera at the Beatles took a good photograph. And the same person, and this is a very Liverpool thing. There's this theory that it is impossible for 2 or more people, often men, but anyway, 2 or more people to go out for a drink in Liverpool without at some point talking about the Beatles. Somehow the conversation always comes around to that. And I suppose it's that thing that they have dominated culturally people's lives so much, certainly people of my age anyway. And for me, this film is a beautiful, beautiful celebration of what they have done.
It is, and I think we've got a much better understanding now of how they interacted as a band. And this is probably how they've done it all the way from the start, right the way through. We've seen an album, evolving from nothing. We've seen songs developing from nothing. And also that they have their own sort of quality control built in, which Two of Us I think is the perfect example of that, where the harmonies are right. They've got the verses and the chorus and all that is working, but the sound isn't right, and they just try, and eventually say, well, let's try it with acoustic. And yeah, we've done stuff without a bass guitar before, and suddenly with 2 acoustic guitars, George playing sort of a bass riff but on his electric guitar, suddenly the finished song is there, and I don't think they ever accepted mediocre. They weren't prepared to do it.
Isn't there a point in it, quite a long way through the rehearsal period, where Paul McCartney says to John Lennon, and so how many songs do you think we've got that are good enough to go on the album? And John says none.
Yeah, because they're just not ready. You know, and even just a few days before they're going to do this performance, and I think this shows the nervousness, the fact they hadn't performed before an audience, and they keep referencing the same one. After Hamburg, they went to Leicester de Montfort Hall, said, and it wasn't a good gig at all, but that's the first time we did it, and then after that everything was good. I think that's what they were looking for, was to go somewhere, a bit like Paul did with his first Wings tour, go somewhere small and then just perform together live, and then they go and do.
So here's a question for you, and let's end on this. Here's a good question for you, which is, they did that performance on the Rooftop, and we then know that partly because of the intervention of Alan Klein, everything went to pieces and they eventually split up. Do you think once they'd done that little show, in their minds might have been, let's do some more of this, we enjoy performing together?
Well, there was, because don't forget, you know, even though Let It Be came out, the album, as the last album released, it wasn't the last album recorded, because from this they then go and record Abbey Road, which most of the time I still come down and say is my favourite Beatles album. I think that is brilliant, the way they put that together. It's great songs. Again, trying to capture what they'd originally done with George Martin. And they put a great album together. And we know from transcripts of conversations, they were still talking, well, we could do this. One of the points George makes in the documentary, and he's saying, no, I've got all these songs, I'm thinking of just going off and doing my own album. He said, you know, I could do that. These are George Harrison songs. Then we come back together and we'll do a Beatles album. So the various options were still on the table. I think at this stage of Get Back, they weren't considering breaking up. They'd had that spat, you know, with George. Paul had that moment where he thought John had quit as well. But then once they were back together and they were having that fun, I think they thought, yeah, no, this is good, we're not ending. Then it all goes, I always say, it goes pear-shaped to apple.
Very good.
Very good. And it does. And that's one of those clever things Peter Jackson's done with this. All the way through, every now and again, it's just a little reference to Alan Klein. John's been meeting with him. Then you hear nothing. Then he's starting to talk, I think it's to George and Ringo.
He does, yeah, that's right, yeah.
So he's now saying, but he's great, he does all this, he's wonderful for the Rolling Stones. At that point, we're sensing, we know what's coming next because of what did happen, but obviously they don't. But that's clever, just every now and then, just these little references. Alan Klein's name gets mentioned. And of course, to me, that was the final nail in the coffin. Was Klein comes in, John, George, Ringo want to go with him. Paul obviously wants to go with the Eastman family. And that leads to the end of it, but...
Do you know what I've just thought, and this might be something that people who watch our channel want to do. And I know it's a game other people have played before, but maybe this could be the basis of another podcast for the future, is to take the first 4 solo albums that the Beatles made and actually select track lists off that and put together what might have been the next Beatles LP. Yeah,
a few people have had to go with that, and it's an interesting thing to do, because you're going to think of all the solo albums that came out, have any of them individually been as good as a Beatles album? And that is where it gets very subjective.
Yeah.
But if you do start taking the very best out of, and doing it chronologically, taking the best songs out, you do make some very, very good Beatles albums. It's definitely worth doing.